In section 1.1, what we choose to study, we're going to begin by talking about some of the basic terminology for statistics. In particular, when we talk about statistical studies, like we alluded to in the unit opener and the chapter overview, we need to be careful about what our studies are actually studying. And this sounds redundant and kind of meta, but the point is that without having something to study, we don't know what to collect data from. So let's begin then with the idea of a population. So whenever I write down a word with this dark blue color, this is a vocab term in our associated textbook, and maybe a little bit out of order, but the point is that this is a vocab term in the textbook and you can go and refer to it in the same section. So by population we mean the total collection of subjects that we wish to study. So everything and everyone maybe that we want to study. I have here a picture of California, namely the counties of California. There's like 40 something of them. And when we think of population, we typically think of people, right? So what is the total population of California? Well, we're asking how many people live in California. And that's something on the order of 30 something million people. But our population may be something different, right? So it can be people, which is common. So if we want to study the people living in California, we might be talking about someone who lives in Sacramento County or San Luis Obispo County. We may be even talking about cities. So not someone now, but a specific municipality or city, like West Sacramento or Los Angeles. We may be talking about counties or even businesses, right? So a company that's based in California is Uber, for instance. They have their seat in Santa Clara County, I believe. And so if you're looking to study the businesses who have their headquarters in California, that's a different population than, for instance, counties or people. Now, when we talk about data, the reason why data is secondary to... Oh, that's the wrong color. Sorry. The reason why data is secondary to your population is because data are any observations or any information that we can draw from our population. So from people, for instance, from people we can draw information like blood pressure. So blood pressure is a reading. If you've been to a doctor's office, you know that they put the cuff around your arm, and that measures your blood pressure, your systolic and the other one. But that is data that's collected from people. You can't collect that from cities or counties or businesses. On the other hand, from cities, you can collect information like yearly budget in terms of like how much they're allowed to spend every year. From counties, you can collect information like proportion of homeless people to total population in that county. I know we're using the word population in two different contexts here, so that's important to keep track of, right? In terms of this data point right here, proportion of homeless people, we're talking about as people living inside that county, right? Or for businesses, for instance, we might be talking about yearly profit or quarterly profit or number of people employed by that business. This is all data, information, observations that we can draw from the population that we're interested in. And most of the time, that's going to depend on what our population is. But if you may have noticed, it's not a hard and fast rule that you know what your population is, right? So for instance, if you want to study something about people in particular, right? How targeted do you want your population to be? Well, that's going to depend. So you can be talking about people living within Sacramento, in which case you're talking about roughly 500,000 people, right? I'm saying roughly. You don't take my word for it. But if you want more generally, right, a broader set of the population, you may be talking about the number of people living in Sacramento County, which is larger. That's something on the order of 750,000 people. If you want to get broader still, you can be talking about Northern California, for instance. I don't have a figure in front of me of how many people that is, but that's larger, right? The important part here is we're talking about broadening how large our population is. We can go in the opposite direction too. For instance, maybe we're interested in studying women. That's our target population. And we can get more targeted than that, right? Maybe we want to study women between the ages 20 and 29. Can we get even more specific than that? Notice that, we're talking about a very large subset of the world population. But for the purposes of a study, this may be too narrow for us or not narrow enough. Maybe we want to study the group of Black women Black or African American women between the ages of 20 and 29. You see how this is more targeted, right? This is a subset of the population that we just talked about. And as a general rule, no matter how good or how targeted we are with the population, let me use an orange color to highlight this key concept. It is generally too costly to study an entire population. In other words, to collect data from every single person, object in your population is unfeasible. You would have to perform something called a census. A census is the act of collecting data from every member of your population. The most famous example of a census is the U.S. Census. In the textbook, we're talking about example 1.1.5, where we talk about the U.S. Census. In fact, in 2020, we just had one, and this is its objective is to count every living person in the United States at that time. So that means every person in every part of the U.S. including the most remote regions in Alaska, in North Dakota, wherever it may be. And most who have not read the Constitution are not necessarily aware of the fact that the census means every person alive in the U.S., not necessarily a citizen. It counts permanent residents. So it counts permanent residents, like my parents, for instance, and undocumented immigrants. Everyone who's here and living here. And that's written into the Constitution, by the way. And that's a lot of people, right? So it is a very costly endeavor. It's an important endeavor, but for most statistical studies, that's just way too much. And that's why we have something called a sample. So the concept of sampling, right? So a subgroup, subcollection, a smaller set of people from your population. We are going to be working very, very closely with samples in particular. Samples are what allow us to understand populations. So for an example, instead of talking about people living in Sacramento, we may have a survey that goes out to 500 Sacramento residents. And that's much smaller than the 0.5 million people. And depending on how well we design that survey and who answers it, it may be giving us insight to the broader Sacramento population. We're going to be seeing a lot of different examples of samples. In fact, a later section here details how we get samples from populations and what are good sampling methods. Before we conclude this video, I would like to talk about how we measure or how we describe a population or a sample. So you should always think of a sample, right, as somehow telling us something about the population. Similarly, if we describe something about a population or a sample, we're talking about something called a parameter for a population and a statistic for a sample. They both mean the same thing. They're a measurement about the thing we want to study. But for a sample, we call it a statistic, and for a population, we call it a parameter. This is going to come back later on, but the important thing is that they typically have the same kind of measurement process as we'll see in chapter 3, but they describe two different kinds of groups.